very excited to have everyone here today. I'm just going to do a really quick intro. I hope you're all here to join you know, a conversation on software supply chain. We're going to be talking about more than just dependencies. So today we have JC, Allan, Wolf, Tanya, and I are going to be your co-hosts. We're going to be diving into all the elements of securing your software beyond just, what you would commonly think are just third-party dependencies. So we're going to be talking about supplier management, verification, securing the development process. We've got all the heavy hitters for supply chain today. So it's a great conversation coming up. Quick intro on myself. I'm currently the security EM for the supply chain security research team at Semgrep. We're the ones that are building the rules for the supply chain product, helping you to find vulnerabilities in your code. And I'll let Tanya introduce herself, and then everyone else will get a chance to introduce themselves as well.
Awesome. So I'm Tanya Jenka, also known as She Hacks Purple, and I'm the head of community and education at Semgrep. And so I host lots of these. So you should come to all of them, essentially, in my very unbiased opinion. And up next, I'm going to go around the circle and go to Allan.
Hey everyone, I'm Allan Freedman. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Most notable is the guy who doesn't shut up about SBOM and other related topics. I'm at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is the primary cybersecurity agency in the US government, and try to help coordinate this effort, not just inside the government, but have people sort of coordinate supply chain issues around the digital ecosystem.
Who's next, Allan? You get to pick.
Oh, excuse me. One of the people who was instrumental in setting up some of the community-led SBOM work is JC Hertz. So go ahead, JC.
I'm JC Hertz. I'm SVP of Cyber Supply Chain at Exeger, which is a third-party risk and supply chain management platform. And I got interested in this topic, but because I co-founded Ion Channel, which is a SBOM consumption and analysis platform, which was acquired by Exeter last year.
Nice work. Wolf.
Good deal. I guess that leaves me. Hi, I'm Wolfgang Goerlich. Tanya, Misha, thank you so much for having me on. I've got a background as being a CISO and IT leader in financial services and healthcare, most recently out of the SaaS product space. So I'm really here to bring sort of a CISO perspective to this conversation, because as we know, on the customer side, we're buying a lot of stuff. We're licensing a lot of stuff. We have more subscriptions than we know about. And I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure it's all secure, right?
Yes. I was going to say, I think just to kind of establish like a common vocabulary here, we have audience members that are, from a wide range of backgrounds and different levels. Kind of wanted to start by just kind of establishing the shared like landscape. How does that sound? Good place to start?
Perfect.
Okay. So just going to throw the first one out there. How would you define software supply chain as a whole?
I will take that. So I feel like I'm playing Jeopardy. I'll take definitions of software supply chain for 200. So I think that there's a tendency in talking about software supply chain by vendors who primarily analyze open source components to define it as, problems in the open source supply chain. And I've even seen one vendor do this explicitly in their marketing materials. And as any asset owner knows, as any enterprise knows, software supply chain, sort of maybe even more broadly extended to cyber supply chain, is all software. That includes firmware, not just IT, also OT, and not just open source, but proprietary software and proprietary firmware, of which there is an immense mountain that looking at open source package managers tells you nothing about. So I think we have to be very adult and business oriented to think about who owns the risk, not necessarily kind of what our kitchen widgets do.
You're saying that vendors shouldn't be the ones defining the problem space for us. Yeah, I think it's great. So when I talk to folks, so right, the high level, fairly intuitive answer to this is we use software. Software is not sort of hewn out of alabaster marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands. It's assembled, and it's assembled out of components by people with processes and tools. And so it's sort of the big collection of there. Often, especially when you get into the compliance world, we see it into two buckets. One of them is kind of synonymous with software assurance, which is, can I make sure there isn't known vulnerabilities in the things that go into my software? But I think there's a much broader piece, which is, can I detect a much broader set of risks in those, ingredients, tools, processes, and humans that were involved in creating that software, both inside my organization and from the folks that are providing me with software, some of which may be open source.
I'll just pause as I soak in both those definitions and think, wow, that is a lot to worry about and control and secure. So, I would add on to that definition, in my view, going back to what do we care about and what can we control? What do we have governance over and control over? From a practitioner perspective, it's all the software in the supply chain of which I have either a direct vendor relationship, or I have a third party or fourth party vendor relationship. That is all the software that is, governing and powering my organization, which I can say, fix this or tell me about that, or I can, exude some customer control over.
Nice. I like that. Misha, do you want to ask the next question?
Yeah. I thought one interesting point that was brought up is focusing on what we have control over, the hardware and software that is managed by the vendors that we're directly working with. And as a security practitioner, it's felt like you oftentimes don't have a lot of control over who fixes what when. So I mean, how would you kind of define how would you define software supply chain security beyond these third-party dependencies, and why is that so important? I mean, we understand it's important from a security perspective, but we can't just say things are important because security, right? So, and how do we focus on the parts that we do have control over?
I just had this conversation this morning with a very, very large manufacturer of critical devices. And the interesting thing about understanding software bills of materials and dependencies, in some ways, like I have a particular view on them because our technology looks for end of life and technical debt and all these other leading indicators, is that an SBOM can actually verify or falsify attestations about process. Right? So there's a questionnaire that goes out. There's always a questionnaire for everyone, right? It's like Oprah, you get a questionnaire and you get a questionnaire, and everybody answers the questions on these questionnaires. And if you're asked a question as a vendor about, do you have something that sounds like a good idea? The answer is always yes. And one of these things is secure software development lifecycle. Absolutely. Completely, we have one. But then, right, an SBOM comes in, like we crank it through our platform. There's other capabilities that could do things like this, where we look at the dependencies, we look at how many versions out of date they are, we look at end of life, we look at how many of them are maintained by a single individual, and some fancy stuff about where that individual is. But if you do have a capability whose components are 6, 7, 8, 9, 14, 15 major versions behind, and have a lot of transitive dependencies with vulnerabilities in them. This problematizes the statement and attestation that you have a secure software development lifecycle. So now the customer can go back to the vendor and say, tell me more about this secure software development lifecycle policy, because I want to know, how it is consistent with this de facto end of life product that we know is this way because of its level of active maintenance. So help me understand your secure software development lifecycle. And so ultimately, all of these, the composition of the product and its level of maintenance, which is a level of investment, is a tell about all the processes about which you're making attestations. And it's going to be tiers when, one of these things, which is ground truth, is another is self-attestation, who are you going to believe? And Allan, I have a feeling you have a follow-up comment on this.
Well, so one, I wanted to sort of really flag something that you put on the table, which is the status quo is questionnaires. And I think that should be a guide point for us of where we should be heading away from. Right, that is currently how the world is working, and we're moving, unfortunately, more in that direction. We have these process standards where now, in addition to a questionnaire, I'm going to pay the big three to say, have you thought about risk of your SDLC? Well, yes. A 23-year-old who went to an Ivy League school sat and watched us talk about it in the conference room for 3 years. And so, yes, we have one. That isn't aligned with the spirit of good security and DevOps. And JC mentioned the idea that we should be working towards artifacts, things that are a natural byproduct of your software creation process, of your DevOps process, of your automation. And obviously SBOM is one of those. And we can talk about some others in a little bit. But I think in SBOM really does give you a lot of these data. Actually, JC was the first person who sort of said, hey, you can look in SBOM and come up with a metric of technical debt. Now, that's not even necessarily a security issue. That's a total cost of ownership issue. If you're going to be customer number 5 of a small new company and they're using a 7-year-old framework, you may say, hey, this works now and we tested it and it's secure, but pretty soon someone's going to have to pay for that massive code refactoring.
I would, in defense of small companies, in all the analysis that we've done, the small companies, just because they got to start with a clean sheet of paper less time ago, tend to have less of that technical debt. And if you look at the real enemy of security is mergers and acquisitions. Because what you see when you go through all of the stuff is that this is something that belonged to a company that was acquired. No one who worked on this is still at the company, and we have no idea how it works, much less how to fix it, and it's just rolling along for the ride. And so I actually gave a talk to FSISAC a few years ago about like the executive order. It's this really bizarre piece of regulation because most regulation favors higher capitalized companies over lower capitalized companies, incumbents over new entrants, right? And less innovative things over more innovative things. But in this bizarro world, if you have less technical debt, you have a more maintainable and defensible product. So you're actually in some cases in a better position to meet the requirements than some of these kind of agglomerations of various mergers and acquisitions that have so much surface area and debt that it's very difficult for them to maintain. And so in some ways, this actually favors new entrants and smaller companies that are fresher and more agile, because I mean, someday they'll be burdened with technical debt too, and they'll be the problem too. But for now, if a customer requires a certain level of active maintenance, they're more likely to meet the bar out of the gate.
You know what I like about what both you guys are saying, and I'm going to say this and it may be dated, so Tanya may come off mute and say, tell us about when we used to use punch cards, Grandpa. But about a decade ago, when I stood up my first DevOps team, we always talked about code smells. Like you couldn't audit a full code base, but you could look for some very obvious tells that the code was not maintained or was not consistent with our standards and what have you. Similarly, in the supply chain, what we oftentimes face is thousands of suppliers. And yes, we're doing questionnaires, but how often do we even read those questionnaires, right? We usually prioritize or have a tagging system. We're going to I'm going to check the top 10 vendors. And of course, it's like second or third tier vendor that allows someone to get in and do something nefarious. What's fascinating about what you're saying is, to me, it almost sounds like a code smell for your software supply chain, right? If I look at the SBOM and I see something obviously amiss, any number of these signals you guys have indicated, maybe that's where we do the deeper dive. Maybe that's where okay, we did the questionnaire. Now let's have a more thorough audit or reassess. I really like that from a prioritization.
We do that too. So we risk tags, for instance, all components that are effectively single maintainer components in Ion Channel are risk tagged. And that's not just single committer components. It's things that say they have 61 contributors, but only half a person cares this month.
Yeah.
Right. So rolling temporal thing. Because if you have, a bus factor tag, which is actually what we say in our front end, then, that's a risk. And then you have to look down to what's the mean time to remediation? Like, does that person really, 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 really care? Or is that person just kind of settled with it? Or like XZ, is that a person who's elbowed their way into it because it has a high penetration? And, what are the risk factors associated with that upstream supplier if there isn't a separation of duties, which we all know is something that's good practice from a security perspective. So yeah, it is a code smell. I think the good thing, and kind of speaking from a third-party risk perspective, is a lot of the third-party risk stuff. I mean, there's like half a dozen companies now that can semi-automate that for the vendors. And that also includes where their developers are, which is another thing that, to think about and care about, not only because certain of them are in countries of concern, but because some of them are in countries that, people have to get out of. I mean, there was a medical device manufacturer talking to, like, one of their development team in Ukraine, and the guy literally was under his desk, pushed to prod, and then went and got the train. So the entity level risk is something that engineers typically don't think about, but it's something that we increasingly have to think about, because it's like I say, software is like Soylent Green, it's made of people. So, we have to pay attention to it.
So I don't want us to get too stuck on dependencies, because the whole purpose here is beyond dependencies. But there's a question I do have for JC and Wolfgang and probably Tanya as well, which is, right, we spend a lot of time thinking about the importance of SBOMs for shipped software, on-premise software. Is this as important for my SaaS providers? Do I need to know an SBOM for them? Because we've had a really fun discussion within the CISA community about that, and there are opinions on both sides. So I'd love to get JC and Wolfgang's take on this.
So the SaaS question is such an interesting kind of thread to pull. And it's one that's almost guaranteed you're gonna like unravel the sweater, right, in the end. But the question about SaaS and transparency, the first question is, okay, well, let's just say a SaaS company gave that to the government in whatever form, and it would be a movie, not a snapshot, right? Because it's always changing. Or any customer, what could they actually do with it? Right? So how actionable is the information is the first question. And then the second question is, because a SaaS is actually, you're trusting an entity, because you're not just taking its software, you're giving that entity your data. So there's a whole other realm of controls that they're going to need to meet that go way beyond the composition of their software. You're going to have to see insider threat. You're going to have to see facilities security. You're going to have to see, governing jurisdiction and all of those standard things, which is what the traditional third-party risk does. And then there's probably some standoff surface area, your bit site, your security scorecard, Black Kite, whatever you're using. And that has to go into the totality of your assessment of a SaaS, because even if every single thing in their stack were squeaky clean, hyper maintained, and, you know, like rebuilt every day, right, which we all know doesn't happen, if they have service providers, right, that are permitted into their infrastructure, all of that software composition information is not going to help you or save you. So
So you're saying that the SB and SBOM doesn't stand for silver bullet. It won't solve all of our risk considerations.
yeah, I mean,
And
and I think that it's also my experience, especially with the larger SaaS companies. I mean, these tend to be technically very mature. Their security staffs are big. They've hired people who really know what they're doing. And they are often much more technically sophisticated than their customers. And so I think we also have to define the protocol and etiquette for talking to people who are more sophisticated than us about what they're doing. And then, you know, the government, certain glass houses situations going on. And so we have to put ourselves in a framework, which actually, Allan, I very much commend you for in NTIA, of all learning together and being constructive about what we're doing if as it comes together.
So not
Sorry
to
to
interrupt the
interrupt.
questions, Misha, can you introduce our new guest?
Yes, I was just going to say we have one of our another panelist that has just joined us, Cassie. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And sorry, I didn't have the invite. I somehow not on my calendar, even though I was all ready today to do it. I was so excited for this. So I am the Vice President for Supply Chain Security at Schneider Electric. We are a 36 billion euro company headquartered in Paris, France. And I've been with the company 14 years in different roles, including in the CISO office on the governance side, but also as a product security officer, have been involved in the SBOM community for, I think now going on 4 years, predating the EO 14028, and have also written the book that you see, I guess, on the picture, Software Supply Chain Security, Securing the End-to-End Lifecycle for Software, Firmware, and Hardware. So thank you for having me.
Nice. So Allan asked a question, and I was thinking maybe, Allan, you could repeat it and Cassie could answer, then Wolf could answer. Is that okay?
Oh, sure. So I want us to move past dependencies, but since I talk about SBOM, I was curious, how do we think about SBOMs not just for software that's running on our networks, but SaaS, which in almost everything, even when it is an on-premise device, has an application level. Modern DevOps is built around this idea. So is this, when we're thinking about supply chain risk, should there be transparency from the SaaS provider? What does that look like? Because it's more dynamic, and why, right? JC said, hey, you need to know about other risks, but I'd love to hear what Cassie and Wolfgang have to say. And Tanya, of course, you spend a lot of time in this space as well.
Well, from my perspective, I guess was sort of hoping for that beautiful answer from the CISA working group. So putting it back on you a bit, we have different definitions. So when a customer is more asking what are the main components, I guess we provide that, but we don't get asked, because if we're hosting it, usually, especially let's just say for Log4j, everything was resolved very quickly. I mean, it's like turning over and updating like that. In regards to what we get more questions about, honestly, is more about the data practices. So, they're less concerned because they know the responsive nature of SaaS, and more concerned about where the data is being housed and wanting that level of product transparency if we're hosting it. Now, if they're hosting it, we have some, I would say, I wouldn't call them SaaS applications, but we have some large software systems. And those have been very interesting to create the SBOM on, and JC's seen one of those for our EcoStruxure building operations platform. And those can be run on Windows platforms or any, Linux, and it has different variations. And they're really monolithic applications. And that's been pretty interesting as we've been diving into that.
Well, I'm going to take the opposite standpoint, which is a very difficult thing to do with you two experts in the room. But, here's the thing. For most enterprises today, SaaS applications outnumber internally deployed applications nearly 100 to 1. Part one. Part two is absolutely we're going to audit, we're going to send questionnaires, someone made a joke about SOC 2. We're going to ask for SOC 2 and we're going to get back AWS's, because that happens 9 times out of 10 with smaller SaaS companies. Certainly we still need to do all that. And I want to know where my data is going, and data sovereignty and all that is also important. But when things like Log4j happen, but when things like, Move It happens, but whenever the next big thing happens, and I'm asked, hey, of our SaaS vendors, who's running this? I don't want to be sending out a questionnaire to, 3,000 SaaS vendors, nor do I think the 3,000 SaaS vendors want to be answering that questionnaire. So I almost feel that SBOMs, what may be a slightly different use case, I almost feel that SBOMs are more important in the SaaS environment where I don't have any visibility and I have very few controls.
Yeah, I agree with that, Wolfgang, but SBOM doesn't have a lot of the components that we're now providing. So we're creating this product transparency piece that talks about, here are the ports, here are the protocols, here are the this, here's the that, because it's so much more that they want to know. And you're right, we shouldn't have to send questionnaires. This should be information that when you're making a procurement decision, it shouldn't be pulling teeth.
I think it'd be really good if the SBOM contained not just these are the components we have or these are the versions, but also if there are known vulnerabilities, if we included that, if we included as much contextual information as possible as well, that would be really nice, whether it be for a SaaS product or not.
Tanya, I'm gonna push back on that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is and I think I'm hearing you wearing your developer hat. Yeah. And that totally makes sense. Inside a development organization, it makes sense to track all of your data around, I want the source, I want the build artifacts, I want the permissions, and you want all kinds of data in there. If you're thinking about it from a supply chain perspective, it's going to hop across organizational boundaries. And there's a huge architectural distinction we should be making between static data and dynamic data. An SBOM refers to a piece of software as built. Now, in the SaaS context, it's yesterday's build, and today's build is going to be different, but it's still static with respect to a given build. Whereas vulnerability data is going to change over time. End of life data is going to change not quite as fast, but will change over time. And so the architecture we try to promote is to emphasize linkability, which is hard, rather than putting everything inside an org. If you're wearing your supply chain hat, if you're wearing your dev hat, and I want to be clear, for example, the OWASP community that created Cyclone DX, a lot of their decisions were driven by developers for developers. And so that's where it's important to sort of think through who's going to be using this data. Is it going to be internal or external?
It's really hard to take off your dev hat. And that I'm like, oh God, I am so biased. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is, so we keep talking about dependencies, and we're going to talk about more than dependencies. And a thing I find that very few organizations talk about is like, where is our code kept? And is it protected? What about all the different environments that we deploy to? How have we protected those? Like if we have a bunch of sandboxes, even just your CI/CD, you can spend a really long time setting that up. And I don't know about the rest of the panelists, but I've worked at a place, like multiple places where we've lost the code repo. I've worked at places where the pipelines got like erase for whatever reason, and then we spent like weeks rebuilding everything. Like, what does everyone else think about that? And I know that it's like a lot of us are moving towards using SaaS products. So it's like, don't worry, Microsoft's got it handled. But lots of us still aren't doing that. And I still have to help people clean things up. What is everyone else's thoughts on that?
And I'd be curious to ask if you guys have any like best practices or frameworks that you can mention um, along
Um,
with that.
I know that we have, and it's the slightly tangential, but so one of the things that Exeger has done with the government and vendors, and Cassie's been part of this process at Schneider, is we have something called the Assured Product Playbook, which goes to one of the comments in the chat, which is how do we reward vendors who are willing to provide an additional layer of transparency. So if a vendor is willing to step forward and say, okay, well, here's our software, here's our SBOMs, here's our HBOMs, right? And then there's a full illumination of that. That vendor should be rewarded for that transparency versus a vendor who does not provide that information. So we tend to get caught up in findings, but having the transparency in the first place automatically should put someone in a preferential position versus someone who doesn't provide that transparency. So I think that this is this sort of constructive phase of rewarding transparency that has to happen. To the code stewardship question, this is a perfect example of why SBOMs don't really help, right? Because if you lost your code, it doesn't matter what was in it. It's in the garbage disposal. And this is an organizational, operational risk management and continuity of operations issue. So continuity of operations is a very, very important operational capacity. And you certainly want to have it, and your customer should certainly want to know what your plan is and what your procedures are for it, because it's really shockingly common, to your point. And so that we used to have to, fill out these questionnaires about, remember, like disaster recovery, right? To get any kind of contract with anybody. And in some ways, cloud obviated the emphasis on that, because the customer was really worried that, you're going to be in a place and that's where your code is, you're going to get hit by a hurricane. And, but if you look at things like ransomware, if you look at, all kinds of factors now, that same operational continuity planning should be present, and that's part of security. So, this is definitely something that the smart customer is going to want to ask.
I just want to add on to that really quick, because, from a consulting perspective, I got so many calls whenever there was a new requirement, right? When it was BCDR, I would be brought in to help an organization stand up their BCDR program. When it was SDLC, I had SaaS vendors calling me to establish their SDLC guidance. And likewise, when SBOMs first came out, I was seeing those on RFPs. Like, if you supply an SBOM, you're automatically at a higher tier and you get bonus points for your product. So what I like about that is the flip side. As a CISO, how am I building my program? Oh, if you don't do this, you're at risk and you're going to lose money and you'll be in the press. No one really cares about that. A much better case is, oh, do you know what? 6 of our customers asked for this. Do you want to lose deals, or do you want to grow your business?
Absolutely.
It's grow your business.
No problem can be solved on the level that created it. This is a computer science problem that needs to get solved on the level of economics. I have a paper in peer review right now about that.
Ooh, I want
But
to see that.
the question in chat about development tools, we are seeing this come up all the time. And so it's not just what's your SBOM, it's, the customer wants to see a list of, what is your tool chain, right? So what dev and test tools are you using? What build tools are you using? I've already seen a vendor who used TeamCity have to go through a lot of additional wickets. There was a customer who, they essentially had to agree to like have themselves reverse engineered because they were using TeamCity. And so trust but verify. And I remember from back I mean, I used to monitor Jenkins plugins. Some of those things are made in Russia. So the tool chain is absolutely part of your security framework, and you're going to need to account for it somehow.
So in terms of sort of as we sort of start to map out software creation beyond just dependencies, first is, okay, where are my dependencies kept? And I would argue general best practice right now is the organizational repository. There's some guidance that CISA and the NSA put out in December that talked about how to plan that and how to build that. And just sort of saying, hey, trusted versions, this helps for organizational efficiency as well, because it means your organization doesn't have, hey, one project team's using one version, another is using a different fork of the same thing. So there's value there. That is hard though, right? That requires a certain amount of centralization and can go too far. So if it takes 2 months to get the new version approved to go into your source repository, you're going to have a bad time, right? That's not agile. That's not dynamic. So I'll paste a link to that report that came from the NSA and CISA in industry. Then we've got our build process. And one of the aspirational pieces that I really like, and this is still evolving technology, but I think it's where we want to head, is an open source project called In Toto. It's developed by some folks at Purdue and NYU. It's an open source security foundation project right now. And the vision behind it is just to say at every step of my build process, I'm going to create a cryptographically secure attestation of the event that just happened, right? This just was pulled in at this machine. This machine ran this packager, and so on. So you can get machine identity, you can get user identity, and so on. Now this is stuff that requires a lot of attention for implementation today. I don't know too many organizations that can do it without a lot of hand-holding. The good news is that there are companies today that will explicitly do your hand-holding for you, that they will sort of give you that layer on for that process.
Ellen?
Yeah.
So this is where I have strong disagreements with my dear friend Allan, because so there's certain, I don't know, the metaphors just kind of pour out. It's like it's self-licking ice cream cone or Field of Dreams, or I don't know, but like they think there are certain very, very critical applications, right? So some incredibly high assurance systems for which that level of kind of safety engineering is advisable and maybe even necessary. But the cost, not just in financial costs, but in operational costs and loss of velocity and like overhead of this is just unbelievable. And the second thing, as we have seen the comment in chat, you can cryptographically sign garbage, right? So you know, it doesn't really say anything about like what is the problem in the payload. Like XC is totally possible with all of this going on. And so I think that if the question is chain of custody, and that's the concern, the question is, how do we solve that chain of custody problem in the most efficient possible manner? Like In Toto is one suggestion that if you have, you know, a huge amount of overhead in your organization, you can implement. But I think the strategic point is chain of custody is important. How can we get it better? And maybe don't make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Completely. And I don't think anyone is saying that, but the one is looking at the guidance that I just mentioned, which says, okay, here's some of the pieces that you could use at each set. I think aspirationally, that should be where we try to set our compass, is to have machine level attestations, going back to the idea that surveys are bad and the alternative to surveys is artifacts, where you can sort of show at each and every point, we can't do this today, but that should be where we're aiming, which is this action happened here and then we can either collect that data, aggregate that data, analyze that data,
I
et
think
cetera.
that's important.
That's where I want to
and
head.
It's good forensically. I will say prospectively, you know, and I say this as like intelligence professional, like this is where you want to do intelligence, you want to run intelligence. So our approach to this is looking at pattern of life. Because I will tell you, Allan, and we have the data on this, if you have a project with a maintainer that has assumed control from a former maintainer and whose actions have been validated by decoy accounts, and we can prove that, I will tell you that is a component that you're signed or not, you're going to want to give a deeper level of assurance, right?
But then we're going back, right? But now we're going back to dependencies, and we've all agreed that dependencies are important. And so now the question is, what comes after your dependencies?
Yeah,
It's
there's
with
more.
personnel in a company. If you have, you know, personnel in a country of concern who are developing this code, they're going to use in toto for it, maybe if they could get it into a high assurance customer, and everything's going to be signed. But that's not the problem, right? The problem is that you have a level of, you know, personnel penetration into a supplier because of its beneficial ownership, because of who owns, you know, a golden share of it, or because of where it is. And that's something that you need to know about that supplier when you consider buying their product, not just that everything they did was signed.
And
Yeah.
that is why we're never going to get rid of questionnaires, because you're going to want to care about this, right? Insider threat is always going to be a risk, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do other supply chain work as
And
well.
it doesn't mean the questionnaires are the answer either, right? Because, like, you know, you have, look, we scan companies' LinkedIn's, like we can tell you where their people are. And so that it's almost like the standoff surface area. Like you don't have to give consent for a customer to run a bit site or a security scorecard or a black kite scan on you. And the same applies for, you know, a lot of the other things about you as a corporate entity. And I think we're going to go even further into that. And of course, it's like layered security, right? Everything. But you can't necessarily substitute one of these things for the other.
I agree. I feel like, oh, am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Someone was like, "You're muted," and I was like, "Oh, am I?" Everyone seems to be responding. No, there's so much, like, so that is one angle that's super important. I feel too, we're talking about how we can prove to a customer that we're well documented and that we know what's in the code, but not only that matters, right? Like, it's also the security of the code. And it's, so again, like, my dev hat is firmly attached, but how we're protecting our own organization. Like, this might sound nuts, but last year I was working with a client going through their DevOps pipelines, and I'm like, why does this one guy have 2,800 pipelines? And they're like, what? And I'm like, is he in charge? No, guess what? His cloud bill was like 30K a month, and he was just effing around. And he got fired later that week. And it turned out he was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars that he did not, and they had no idea. And so, like, who has permission to run these things as well? And that's part of their supply chain. Like, they thought their cloud bill was crazy, and that because they were thinking, like, maybe we should go back to on-prem, like, we just can't afford it. No, it's just one dude that's completely out of hand, right? Now their cloud bill is like this big.
Ungoverned permission to Amazon Glue will run your bill up, and I have personal corporate experience of that. So yeah.
Yeah, I've also seen, yeah, I've caught embezzlers a couple times in my career. But what are some other ways that we could try to secure the supply chain besides, like, locking down who's allowed to make a CI/CD or how many you're allowed? And, like, definitely making sure our dependencies aren't maintained by a certain special person who works for a country that hates our country, like you said, but you said a lot more politically correctly. What are some other things? Because there's so many parts of the supply chain that we need to secure, not just that one part.
Can I inspire that
Yeah.
a little bit with by adding in a question from one of our audience members? So the question is, software is also made using software. Any thoughts on in security of development tools such as software suppliers, IDEs, who has the SBOM of the developer's favorite third-party VS Code extensions? Maybe that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I would love to talk about this because it's something that I bring up frequently. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. That I bring up frequently to CTOs, CIOs, CISOs, and everything, is that as a developer, because if they haven't been a developer, they don't know how easy it is for us to add anything onto our platforms because they're not controlling that environment like they are the finance, HR, and everybody else. And so you really have to, in my opinion, you really have to look at the full threat model for the development landscape so that developers realize the risk, because you don't want to lock them down. But they can add any IDE plugins, they can have keyloggers, they can have who knows what. And they're not reviewing the code, they're not doing inspections, they're not scanning any of that. We just bring it down because it's the cool new tool I just saw listed on something else. And as someone who's very concerned about the R&D environment and the risks that are in, what I suggest is, hey, threat model the entire environment so that you're bringing security and dev people in and talk about, here, let's just run it, not just on the build process, but how you bring in code. Are you doing scanning? Are you doing this? By threat modeling what they have and making them produce that, what are you putting on your IDEs, and going through at least a peer review process. Like, please don't download anything except for these tools. And if you want something else, let's look at it as a team. And developers can own that, but they don't realize the risk most of the time. Because again, it's just like, I'm going to the store and this looks cool and this looks cool and this looks cool. And they've got a free check because it's all free. But most of it is going to be, in the coming days, a lot of malicious pieces put in there, because that's how I would do it. I would be sitting there giving here's not only the open source you can use in your product, but here's a great new IDE tool that does everything that you want. And oh, by the way, it has all these backdoors in it. So yeah, here's a gift, it's poison.
I mean, we could even look at SDKs, so there's the tool chain that you're using to build your software. But I'll tell you, having inspected a metric ton of SDKs on GitHub, that not every company actively manages their SDK. And, an SDK is capable kind of almost by definition of all sorts of mischief. And when you combine SDK with low code, then things get really crazy. And so your SDK is part of your product. SDKs are typically not certified to the level of products, but that's a blind spot. And so, that's something that it'd be in the box question. That's something that we look at, and vendors really typically do not like it when we request or require that assurance be conducted not only of their core products, but also their SDKs.
Briefly to go
There's
back. Oh, sorry.
I was going to just hit some low-hanging fruits. So if you go back to the 2021 Cybersecurity Executive Order, where essentially we just decided we're just sick of all of this software being terrible. And so created a policy that essentially got to be this high to have a government contract, and basically the U.S. government buys a lot of software, so it sort of had an impact. And for there, these are things that really should be obvious, but again, we want to make sure there's. And so one of them is make sure you've got MFA used across your development environment. Everyone who's touching code absolutely needs to have MFA. Separate your environments, right? Your build environment should never be part, like a lot of people said, no, DevOps means everything's one environment. No, it doesn't, right? So making sure that you have sort of those administrative separations is one of those low-hanging fruits that every organization can quickly look at and say, internally at least, oh, we got a problem here.
It's so true. Identity and access management is a surprisingly important thing with development. I saw this talk by this guy named Alex Dow, and he runs like this giant pen testing firm in Canada. And basically they attacked a Jenkins system and they breached it 21 separate ways. 21, like breaking into the company and able to release code on their behalf that was signed 21 ways. 21 separate exploits, or like separate, like he chained a bunch of exploits for each one. And I was just like, I'm really glad you're a good guy, because you're terrifying, like so scary. And then he went over if you just did like any sort of hygiene here, we wouldn't have got in if you hadn't been downloading random stuff off Docker Hub, if you hadn't been, and it seems like for us on this panel, probably it seems obvious, but like, how do we get that message across to the public? Like,
Right.
how
And
do we get them on board?
right after they do the threat model, they should do a pen test. And especially for, I mean, we do that, require that for our crown jewel applications and such. And it should be, I mean, anybody running through this, I think that's great. I would love to see that report. That case study would be awesome.
And then beyond the sort of pen testing, I mean, there are some relatively sophisticated reverse engineering capabilities now and startups providing them. And we work with some of those guys at Exeger that will effectively create a bill of software behaviors for you. And if there's something that may even be, a third party library from a large publicly traded corporation that you use that contains ingredients congruous to a rootkit, then the sort of behavior of that thing will be documented. And so I think the whole idea of like pen testing itself, it's sort of shorthand for a set of things that's in constant evolution, and that the cyber network penetration paradigm doesn't necessarily cover. So even in static analysis, if you really understand how software behaves, you can begin to understand how it might be exploited outside of necessarily the MITRE attack framework, which is great, but not necessarily everything.
Sadly, we are coming up on our last 4 minutes somehow. The hour went by really quickly.